Okay, so time to begin our first quarterly business report. I'd say we've hit the ground running. It's been a good start. I'll go through the reports and sort of itemize them based on, well, the different features of the game, really, the different kind of things that we control. So we'll start off with a military report. As you can imagine, there's no external threats, but I've used the kind of beginning period, the first few months, really, to kind of reorganize the military, rationalize its structures a little bit. The first thing I've done is to put all the Bashi bazooks back from the frontiers. These are the kind of the paramilitaries, if you like, the irregular militia forces that we have. And I've deployed them principally in regions where we have a bit of dissent risk. So we have a look at revolt risk, and we have dissent risk in these regions for things that you can imagine. I mean, there's a revolt risk, of course, in the northern provinces of Greece. These areas are ethnically Greek. It doesn't mean to say they all support the Greek or the sort of southern Hellenic states. Some of the Greeks actually support us, but it's enough that it's a kind of problem. So we've moved them back and we've placed them over locations where we have Bulgarians, Greeks, and Serbs who perhaps are less sympathetic towards our presence there than we would otherwise like. Once I did that, it instantly became obvious to me that some of the border areas they were sitting in, they were kind of functioning as a border police force. These areas also actually developed a revolt risk once I pulled these forces back. The problem with kind of moving forces to deal with revolt risks with the Ottoman Empire is it's rather like stamping on fire ants. You know, you sort of lift one foot up only for the sort of the fire ants to swamp the area that you're not stamping on. But anyway, I've moved them back, and the important thing is to kind of deal with the rear, particularly the mountainous regions that are a bit tough to get to. They're particularly difficult to get to off season as well, when you've got heavy snows and rains and this kind of thing, to function as a kind of garrison force. And have done the same thing in sort of Armenia, the sort of Eastern Anatolian areas. We've actually got a fairly large Bashi Bazouk force here. We've scattered some smaller forces, and we've also detached a cavalry brigade comprised of 2 light cavalry regiments from the 4th Army under Abdi Pasha, just south to Van, because there was a small kind of revolt risk there. The problem with revolt in kind of Eastern Anatolia and the Kurdish and Armenian regions is these regions, as I mentioned earlier, they're not very well developed. They're quite mountainous, quite hard to get to, quite far away from our centre in Constantinople. So a large revolt here could easily kind of develop a bit of a momentum, which could become kind of problematic. And Abdi Pasha's force is an infantry corps. It's a pretty large force, but it's really meant for border defence, and it's quite a slow-moving force as well. Often insurgencies develop the character of being quite fast-moving, quite small, irregular type troops themselves. I should say that these Bashi bazooks, they have a fairly limited combat value. I've tended to move them into regions where we don't have fortified towns or cities, but we have depots and this kind of thing, and we don't want depots and arms caches falling into the hands of insurgents. But they have a fairly limited combat value. In the event of any kind of serious insurgency or revolt breaking out, they're not terribly effective at sort of dealing with them, unless the revolt is very, very kind of small and regional. Maybe a small rural area is kind of is going into revolt. Then they can sort of deal with that. But once they're sort of settled, their principal purpose is to act as a deterrent, to kind of try and nip these problems in the bud using, I suppose, pretty bleak extrajudicial methods. So that's what I've done with the Bashi bazooks. With the kind of main standing army, what I've done is to kind of take a rib out of the force that I had in Palestine or Syria, which we don't need large forces in the Middle East. What we need are small mobile forces that can maneuver quite quickly to deal with any kind of insurgencies or problems that develop in these territories. So Khurshid Pasha is in control of a cavalry division of about 5,000 men. 5,000 men with a small kind of convoy supply train. He's the perfect leader for this kind of operations, counterinsurgency. He's a cavalry commander. He's an admired commander. So he's someone that's going to sort of use this force to the kind of to the best of its abilities. He's really well suited to this. We've got a slightly less mobile force under Hussein Avni in Baghdad. We're going to keep him in Baghdad, and we have detached a cavalry brigade comprised of 2 light cavalry regiments south towards Kuwait. I will talk a bit more about that shortly as to why I've done that, the reason behind that. But what I have done is to try and bring in all of my main standing army towards Edirne or Adrianople. and for good reason. The reason I wanted to do this is to rationalize my deployments and build up a really large single kind of imperial army in Edirne. This is the kind of army that would be used to intervene in the event of Russian incursions or even an Austrian incursion towards Bosnia. I'm going to finish this rationalization a little bit now. I have an army corps under the command of Abdul Karim. I don't really want Abdul Karim commanding an army corps, and I'm going to detach a cavalry division from Rita Pasha's main army to Abdul Karim. Now, Abdul Karim is in command of 2 cavalry divisions. What I want Abdul Karim to do is to serve as my ball and chain in the Balkan Peninsula. Now, we have scattered irregular forces. Some of them irregular, some of them are actually small regular brigades, like the Kazakh Tuyari. This is a small cavalry brigade comprised of 2 regiments. So we have a mixed brigade comprised of 1 infantry and 1 light cavalry Bosnian force in Constanta. But these 2 kind of brigades combined with our Bashi Bazouks, which are, some of them are actually garrisoned inside towns, as we can see here in Petrik and in Plovdiv, I think also. These irregular forces, of course, are scattered. They're fanned out across the Balkan Peninsula to try and discourage revolt. In the event that a revolt happens, what we want is to have a regular, quite mobile force that can intervene. And 2 cavalry divisions, which is going to be 10,000 men under the command of a pretty capable officer. He's a Lieutenant General, Abdul Karim Nadir Pasha, but he's a fast mover. And he's an Elan tactician of Elan, so he's perfect for a kind of decent cavalry force. In the event of any kind of insurgency or serious revolt, he's going to be able to move quite quickly to kind of deal with that in the event that the irregular or the smaller formations are not able to. Now, we have the only event that we've really had is we've received an intelligence report to suggest that Albanian kind of rebels are beginning to arm themselves and beginning to look to prepare for an insurgency. Now, in Tirana, we do have a sort of garrison division, a fortress division based there, and we have Bashi Bazouks nearby. I'm going to break these Bashi Bazouks up now so that they're, instead of being a kind of division size, they're brigade size comprised of 2 regiments each, and we're going to move one of the Bashi Bazouks. Takes 11 days. The weather's actually not too bad here now. We're kind of entering into spring. We still have some snowfall in central Bulgaria, but with clearer weather, we can now move these guys across quite difficult terrain without experiencing any kind of serious losses. And the Bashi Bazouks are going to sit in Albania and sort of function as a deterrent. We don't have any indicated revolt risk here, but that is something that might very well change based on that intelligence report. I think that's it. In terms of military matters, that's it. In Constantinople itself, we've rationalized our fleet organization a little bit. So we have our main fleet. The main Imperial fleet has got 2 commanders, actually, in case we want to break them up into 2. And we also we've separated out a transport fleet. In fact, it was our transport fleet that was used to pick up the army corps from Khurshid Pasha and bring that to our first army under Rita. The reason being is it's actually, as I mentioned, I think in my sort of first video, it's much easier to actually deploy forces and intervene in the Middle East using maritime means. It's much, much faster than it is traveling over this really difficult terrain, which at this time would it takes a very long period of time. There aren't railroads or anything just yet. We've also created a small raiding force. Now, in the event of hostilities breaking out with Russia, the purpose of Osman's force would be to move north and sit inside the trade box in the Black Sea, interdict Russian commerce there, and we will support that with a main fleet that will conduct standing patrols in the Black Sea. As a maritime power, we're not in a bad shape. I mean, given that our main opponents are likely to be either Russia or Austria, I would say that we probably have parity with Russia in terms of our sort of maritime strength. In fact, we can kind of corroborate that a little bit by going to have a look at scores. Russia. Okay, so that's not quite true. In terms of combat naval power, Russia has about twice the size navy than we do. However, of course, that is going to be split into the Baltic and so on. So I'd like to think that we probably have something close to naval parity in the Black Sea. With Austria, I think we probably have a larger navy than Austria, so I don't think Austria is going to be a significant threat just yet. Austria obviously has merchants in the Mediterranean trade box, so in the event of hostilities with merchants, we can send our kind of raiding fleet comprised of 3 squadrons to interdict Austrian shipping there. That's it in terms of military report. Our military is kind of rationalised now. The only other thing is we did have a small force located in Aden. We're actually beginning to move that north out of harm's way. Now, I'll go into this a bit more in my colonial report. We're going to kind of basically pull out of the Hejaz and Aden for the time being. We don't want any military units there, and for good reason. This is an area that in order to properly consolidate this region and turn it into a formal colony and sort of annex it, is going to require a serious force for pacification. We don't want to dissipate our forces just yet. We're not in a position to spread out our forces. And this is an area that's quite difficult to supply as well at the moment. So we would not be able to supply core-sized forces intervening in the Hejaz. So we want to be a little bit cautious about that. We don't want to be bogged down in a colonial effort that's basically going to kind of result in us hemorrhaging resources and manpower. Not at this early stage when we still have a quite sort of small and vulnerable economy. So that's the military report. In terms of my economic report, we can see that in January we had 75 private capital. This is now ramped up to 629, and that is despite the fact that we've been spending some private capital. I'll talk about what we've spent that on in my colonial report. We've imported a small amount of manufactured goods. The reason being is we do produce enough manufactured goods to meet domestic consumption, but we actually want to begin to stockpile manufactured goods. Manufactured goods are required for the building of certain kinds of things, agricultural enterprises, factories and railroads. So we want to start stockpiling manufactured goods. One of the first measures that I took in terms of economy was to look at particular commodities that we're producing a lot of. So one is cereals, and you can see the 80% just at the bottom of this pop-up. What I've done is I've opened up the taps a little bit in terms of what we're making available on our domestic market. I want to make sure that what we're producing a lot of is readily available in our domestic market to buy. The reason being is selling goods in our domestic market makes us much more money actually than exporting it. That doesn't mean to say that we can't make good money exporting certain kinds of goods, but if we export, if we for example sell one unit of fruits or cereals on the domestic market, that one fruit is going to make that one fruit that's consumed, that's bought, sold, if you like, on the domestic market, it's going to make us more money than if we exported it. Whenever we export commodities, we export them at a wholesale price. That doesn't mean to say that at some point we actually may make more money exporting, especially when the global economy develops much more, becomes much more sophisticated and interconnected. We might end up making a huge amount of money exporting certain kinds of commodities that are readily available. So I've opened up the taps in terms of what's available. This is also really good for satisfaction. Now satisfaction sits at around 50%. Our population's relatively indifferent to the government, which is quite common in most places. But this is an average. In some areas it's going to be less, in other areas it's going to be more. Now, providing our local population with a lot of kind of relatively cheap different foodstuffs, varied foodstuffs, is important for gradually increasing population satisfaction. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. Like if you're on the verge of revolution, suddenly making fruits available isn't going to cut it. What's required is a prolonged period of access to this kind of commodity that's readily available in the domestic market at an affordable price. And we've done just that, and that will sort of pay dividends in the long run. Now, when we look at our regional census, we can see that this is slightly variable. As an average, it's 50%. In some areas, it's a little bit less. The population is much less sympathetic towards the government. In other areas, the population is more sympathetic. Now, if we look at certain areas, we can see that there are some signs of civil strife in some areas. It's fairly small. But we can see in Bitlis, we actually have strikes. Now, Bitlis is kind of over here. Actually, it's sort of in the sort of Armenian part of our territory. We don't have any RGOs. We don't have any capitalist agricultural enterprises there. We don't have any factories or anything like that, of course. So these strikes, this is really kind of local disputes. These are local sort of tenant farmers that are squabbling with their landlords and this kind of thing. And this is an area that is ethnically predominantly Armenian and Orthodox. So this may be what's behind this. This is not something to be overly concerned about. This doesn't really affect our national economy. It's a local dispute, but it's something that has been sort of marked up. We have some demonstrations of highly localized stuff, nothing to lose any sleep over. We certainly want to keep an eye on Izmit and Sinop. These are areas that we don't really want to have this situation get any worse. Izmit and Sinop are quite important territories to us in the long run. Izmit is very close to Constantinople, and Sinop is a candidate city for industrial development at some point. It's already a number 2 city. It's already so it's a city that's likely to grow. So we want to keep a little bit of an eye on that. One of the things that really deals with public satisfaction is workers love to see the development of the productive forces. They like to see factories being built. They like to see railroads. So once our economy begins to grow and we can develop this region, that will deal with a lot of that. That will begin to kind of deal with a lot of the sort of dissatisfaction that we're seeing in this area. There's no real prospect of any kind of open revolt or any kind of revolutionary activity at this stage. It's very localized, small demonstrations, maybe to do with local issues, and one case of withdrawal of labour, again, in a kind of local setting. But yeah, our economy has really hit the ground running, actually. One of the most important reports I tend to look at, we can see what's being sold. So we've been consistently exporting fish, fruits, dyes, and now we've started exporting chemicals. Chemicals and dyes are mostly being produced by craftsmen. This is mostly guild-based production, but we're exporting it, and our capitalists are pocketing the money. So they're kind of shafting the earlier the earlier economic mode that we have, and we're converting this into kind of capitalist muscle, if you like. Hopefully these exports will hold strong. It does take a little bit of time for the kind of global economy to sort of have a bit of life. I mean, it's kind of, things are moving now. It takes about a month really for the global economy to become animated and for us to start getting meaningful readings of things. If we scroll down, we can have a look at what's being, so let's have a look. We've sold 34 merchandises. So these are our exports, are netting us 125 per turn, per fortnight. 51 goods sold in our domestic market for 202. This has been fairly consistent since January. It started around 180. It's gradually getting more and more. So this gradually, you can see, is gradually increasing public satisfaction. This will take time. It will pay dividends, though. We absolutely want to make sure it's that these things are sort of continuously available to our population. We are importing, as I mentioned, we're importing 10 merchandises worth 90 this term. That's still a positive balance of payments in terms of trade. That's perfectly fine because they're manufactured goods, and manufactured goods open up options for a bit later. So that's 10 units of manufactured goods imported from the United States, setting us up at 15. We're going to keep doing that. We want to sort of stockpile manufactured goods. Our plan, as I mentioned in the first video, for our economic activity is to build a pretty decent agricultural base. It's really easy to scoff at something like that. You think of an agricultural rural economy as a feature of backwardness. The truth is, even if technology permitted, we would not be in any kind of position to be laying railroads or building factories at this early stage. We don't have the capital, we don't have the manufactured goods or the steel to do that. Really, the way that we have to see our economy is, a house requires strong foundations to be built upon. Every mile of railroad that we're going to lay in years to come, every brick and every factory, the capital for that is going to come from domestic sales of agricultural goods, exports of tobacco, and this sort of thing. So we have to keep that in mind. We don't have a very developed capitalist agricultural economy. We do have agricultural production, but it's very, very small. It's craftsmen. It's it's from that kind of early modern economy that's a part of the legacy of what we kind of inherited, really. Now, a little moment in history. We haven't built any RGOs. We are in a position now to build our first agricultural enterprise. We are going to do that, and we're going to build a cereal farm. And of course, we're going to build from the base outwards, and that's going to be built in Constantinople. Now, if we click on, we can see here that we have cereals is set at 0, so we can basically build one cereal farm, one tobacco plantation, and we can build 2 fishing ports. We already start with 1 fishing port. These roundels really kind of reflect the productivity of a particular commodity in that region. If it's agriculture, it reflects the soil quality, how much of the soil is flat, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine places, I mean, Turkey is obviously quite mountainous. There's some areas of good flat land, like Adrianople, where we can build 2 cereal farms, and this is also the case for Plevna, the sort of flatlands of northern Bulgaria, and of course you've got really rich soil because of the river here. And you can imagine in places like the Midwest of the United States, you're going to be able to build 4 or 5 cereal farms in one location. So it reflects the kind of the quality of the soil. Things like inorganic, things like coal and iron, fairly self-explanatory. It reflects how much of that resource is available. These are not set in stone, these kinds of things. They are variable. As time goes on in our metropole, new resources will be prospected. Of course, there's no access to any kind of oil at the moment. This is not really a commodity that kind of exists very much in the mid-19th century. Certainly, new deposits of coal might be prospected, which will broaden our access to that resource. So we have to bear in mind that these things aren't completely set in stone. We can have gold rushes and things like this. The appearance of new resources, the prospecting of new resources, typically reflects the historical process of where certain kind of resources were found. I think that's pretty much it in terms of our sort of our economic planning. So we're beginning to build up our kind of agricultural base just around Constantinople. We can see that the cereals farm is going to take some time. I didn't actually look at how long it takes. It's going to take 189 days to really get that cereal farm kind of up and running. Now, again, that's not a kind of, whilst it's being built, it will gradually begin to produce more and more cereals. It's not the case that you wait for 189 days and then very mechanically you start producing cereals in that location. This business is gradually being built up. But all of those cereals will be sold in the domestic market. They'll be turned into canned goods, or they can be exported. So the cereals is good stuff, as is fish and fruits. What we're going to do with fruits is fruits that are located, I think, in sort of mainland areas in Turkey and in mainland areas. We're going to turn those into basically fruit plantations. Those that are located in the Greek islands, we're going to turn those into wineries, basically, because that's something that we're going to do a little bit later. Wine requires some manufactured goods to produce, of course. It requires bottling and sort of like the sort of distillery process, however wine is made. I don't know much about that, but it requires some manufactured goods, which we don't have to spare just now. But wine is a great commodity for both the domestic consumption and always exports at a really good price. That's it for our economic report. In terms of a colonial report then, I've rolled the dice a little bit. Early on, I didn't have very much state revenue. I had about 300 and something. I've spent 300 and sent a diplomat with the aim of converting Kuwait into a protectorate. Now, a protectorate is a halfway house between a territory that is merely influenced by us and a colony, which is a territory that is internationally recognised as being a part of our empire. The reason being is in January 1850, we had sufficient colonial penetration to do that, and we had sufficient state revenue to do it. Now, Kuwait and Bahrain, Dubai and Qatar, these are territories that the British also have an interest in, and gradually they will begin to look to achieve some level of colonial penetration in these regions. And you can see that they've already started doing that. They sent a missionary to Kuwait, which will be a permanent feature, which will be a kind of church that they built there. That reduces revolt risk over a prolonged period of time. It can trigger a revolt, but it will also pay dividends for the British. It will begin to provide them with a degree of colonial penetration. We already start off with 35% colonial penetration. That is enough to basically declare a protectorate. It requires a diplomat, 300 state revenue. What really declaring a protectorate is getting the concert of powers, the international community, to kind of recognise that region is kind of ours. And that's what you're spending the money on. It greases the wheels diplomatically to kind of get that moving. And it has practical changes on the ground, of course. Like it fills the local kind of nobility, those that resent Ottoman rule, with a sense of futility. And once that protectorate is declared, it's going to be 4 more terms. So it's going to be 8 weeks. Once that is complete, if we meet the conditions for its completion, which at the moment we do, then Kuwait becomes a protectorate. It makes it much harder really for the British to achieve any kind of meaningful colonial penetration there. It means that it opens the door for us to achieve more colonial penetration by building different kinds of structures there. We've sent a mission ourselves. We're declaring a protectorate. We're going to send merchants there. We're going to set up a trading station as well. We've done the same as you can see here. We're not declaring protectorate status with these locations because we don't have very much colonial penetration. We can see that in Qatar, the British have already achieved some measure of penetration here, and they've also done that in Dubai. To that end, I've sent colonial merchants. Colonial merchants provide us with, they require an outlay. They require about 40 private capital per merchant and a small amount of manufactured goods. Once they achieve sufficient amount of penetration, we can then build a trading station, which achieves, it's a permanent structure, and that over a period of time allows us to sort of develop a colonial penetration of this region. Now, there's a reason for this. Of course, the main reason is that the British have an interest in all of these areas. We don't want to alienate the British, and we certainly don't want them as any kind of foe. Britain as a hegemon during this period, and it would be a catastrophe for us for Britain to go to war with us. But the British don't have a huge amount of colonial penetration here yet. The British are also spread quite thin. They're kind of, they've got their hands full in India. At the end of this decade, they're going to have a big revolt in India. They haven't completely consolidated all of India yet. This is also the case with Australia and Canada. These areas are not consolidated. So the British have got their fingers in a lot of pies, and they're going to be spread sort of fairly thin, I think. And as such, they're not going to be able to focus on this region early on. Once the British have achieved a certain amount of colonial penetration, they can actually stop us converting these regions into protectorate, which means that it'd be very difficult for us to colonize these regions. And the British are much more likely to stake a claim in any kind of region once they've invested something into trying to achieve colonial penetration there. If we get in early, we get the deal done, we get these sort of territories converted into protectorates, then that's really, really good news for us. It's not going to upset the British quite so much. They will still have an interest in these regions, and later on, decades from now, they may decide to kind of try and do something about that. We have to keep that in mind. But the main reason we have to do this is we either become a subject power of the British and become completely dependent on the British for support, or we try and do something for ourselves a little bit. We can see that the commodity here I mentioned in January 1850s, the commodity here is gems. Now, if we get trading stations in all of these territories, these trading stations will achieve colonial penetration, but they will also provide a trickle of this resource into our economy. That's going to be quite important. It's something that will sell in the domestic market for good money, and it's something that will be converted into state revenue. This will top up our tax earnings. So that's something to sort of bear in mind. I think it's really important that we take this measure early on, because this trickle of gems over a period of time, this is something that really will matter. The other colonial kind of moves that we've made a little bit is, now with the Hejaz, I mentioned that we're basically going to step back from the Hejaz. It's not a region that other colonial powers really covet. As such, I don't think we're going to come into any serious competition. I think that, we can already see we kind of militarily control the Hejaz to a large extent. This is gradually going to revert back, I think, to sort of local control, because we removed all of our forces, or we're removing our forces from the Hejaz. We don't want to be caught in a kind of protracted insurgency here that's going to be costly. With kind of Yemen, however, the British do have an interest in the Yemen, and there's some interesting resources here. One is coffee. Coffee is not an extremely expensive or valuable resource, but we don't have domestic access to coffee. We don't want to have to import it from Latin American countries. If we can get a small trickle of this resource, even as a luxury item, this is going to, it's going to broaden what's available to be sold on a domestic market. The other is, of course, opium. Now, opium, we have one area, Bursa, which is here, that has domestic access to opium. We can grow opium in Bursa, or poppies, presumably. Bursa being the original capital of the Ottoman Empire, of course, before it was moved to Edirne, and then Constantinople. Opium is good stuff. I mean, it's always going to sell on the domestic market, and it's something that's always going to export at a premium rate. It's a kind of luxury item. It's highly prized. It's great value for money, like for us. It's a really good commodity that we want to develop. Getting access to opium, even for domestic market sales, even if it's a small trickle at this early stage, will be important. We want to get a bit of a toehold in Aden, Yemen. Yemen is a little bit like the Hejaz. It's a region that could be problematic. We don't want to become... The difficulty is the people that live here, really, in the kind of Arabian Peninsula, they don't really take outside meddling laying down. They're pretty recalcitrant, difficult people. The basis for colonizing these regions is going to be significant economic development in the Middle East, railroads, being able to supply large forces to seriously suppress the region. The problem is, much of what we build here early on is it's going to result in revolts. Any trade stations are likely to be destroyed. That is also the case of missions. One option might be to land a marine force in Aden at some point to build a kind of maybe sort of a coaling station here so we can keep it supplied and begin to develop an operation that way. It doesn't necessarily flow that we have to move to Aden through the Hejaz, actually. We could see this as a kind of a separate thing. We can access this in a kind of, as an amphibious operation, really. So that's it in terms of our colonial moves. Then we've sent colonial merchants to Aden itself and Mukalla to try and begin to develop some colonial penetration here. And once we've achieved enough, we will then begin to set up trading stations. We're fully prepared for the fact that these may be destroyed at some point. We don't really have the resources just now to kind of intervene. That's it, really. That's the first kind of 3 months in the bag. Really, really good start. We've hit the ground running. There's no kind of serious concerns or problems. Reviewing the army and having a look at it, I mean, the Ottoman army is not just big, it's in pretty good shape. The Ottoman army that exists in the 1850s is a product of the Yanicheri, the kind of the new model army that was created at the beginning of the 19th century. It's sort of on par with the European army, actually. It's not a qualitatively inferior army in the same way that the army of the 18th century was. The Yanicheri was formed really to get rid of the early modern army. One of the main aims of the Yanicheri was to get rid of the Janissaries. The Janissaries was the old imperial guard of the Ottoman Empire, and the Janissaries were instrumental, actually, in the Ottoman Empire's early successes. It was the only really standing professional army in Europe at the time, and the only army that was systematically drilled in the use of firearms. And if you can imagine that this force was going up against the Kingdom of Hungary, which at this time would have had drafted peasants in a kind of medieval-style army, you know, it's like a hot knife through butter. So the Janissaries were important. They were an important, you know, sort of stepping stone, really, in our kind of historical development. It's fair to say that by the 18th century, they'd become their sort of opposite, really. They'd become really problematic. The Janissaries, a bit like the Praetorian Guard in the Roman Empire, would orchestrate palace coups. You know, they became a really, really difficult, bloated institution. And in fact, most of our territories in Europe were lost when Russia and Austria would invade almost always in the 18th century in the midst of palace coups. So the Janissaries were destroyed during the part of the sort of forming of this new model army. Rather confusingly, the etymology of Janissary comes from the same word, Yanicheri, new model army, but the Janissaries were a product of the kind of reforms of the early modern period. Our new army are the reforms of the early 19th century. And just because we've lost the Janissaries, that doesn't mean to say we've lost the kind of muscle they provided. We do have one Imperial Guard Corps. These aren't the same as the Janissaries. They don't have any kind of special privileges. They're not going to be organising palace coups, but they are a highly disciplined corps of troops that mostly comprised of infantry. We have one light cavalry, one regular cavalry, two artillery regiments or battalions, and one independent corps command. So it's good to know that we have that. We've still got the kind of, you know, the sort of professionalism that the Janissaries once provided us. That's it for now. That's January 1850 out of the way. A really, really good start. I'll keep you posted. If probably the next quarterly report, I guess I'll deliver in June. And I'll see you in the next one.